Hi there, Gigi from the RBA. In this second video on reading and interpreting charts, we're going to run through in detail some examples from the RBA's monthly chart pack. As we go through these, see if you can note down the important things to remember when you're interpreting charts. I'll share with you my list of tips at the end and we can compare notes. Let's look at our first chart. This chart is called GDP Growth. Now, the fact that we're looking at GDP growth immediately tells us we're looking at how GDP has changed rather than the level of GDP. Let's talk a little bit more about the differences between levels and growth rates, as it's a question that I often get asked. So a level is just an amount of something. If we had 5 apples today, then we could call that the level of apples in our possession. The growth in something is just the change in that amount over some period of time. If, say, the amount of apples we had increased from 5 today to 6 tomorrow, then the growth in apples over one day would be 1 apple, or in percentage terms, 20%. Back on our chart, what this means is that all of the data that we're looking at here is showing us how GDP has changed because it's a growth rate. So the next thing we want to do is figure out what kind of data we're looking at. If you recall from the previous video, we can usually figure this out from the x-axis. Our x-axis clearly displays time, and that means we're dealing with time series data. Remember that time series data is just an observation of the same thing observed in a regular interval over time. Next, let's turn to the detail on the chart. So we have a line and we have some bars. In addition, the units on the y-axis are a percentage, the line is labelled as year-ended, and the bars are labelled as quarterly. What does this all mean? Well, the units on the y-axis show that the growth in GDP is measured as a percentage change. The labels tell us that the line and the bars are 2 different periods of time over which growth in GDP is measured. Year-ended, which is the line, is looking at growth in GDP from one quarter compared to the same quarter 1 year ago. For example, if we're looking at the latest observation for March 2020, this is showing us growth in GDP from March 2019 to March 2020. Quarterly growth, which is the bars, is looking at growth in GDP from one quarter to the next. Again, if we're looking at the most recent observation for March 2020, that's showing us growth in GDP from December 2019 to March 2020. Because quarterly growth covers a smaller period of time than year-ended growth, it makes sense that it's also smaller in magnitude. So now that we understand the chart, let's actually interpret the data. So over the past 30 years, year-ended growth in GDP has mostly come in between 2 and 4%, and quarterly growth between 0 and 1%, so roughly a quarter of year-ended growth. Some key events of Australia's recent economic history are obvious on the chart. We have the introduction of the GST around 2000 here, the global financial crisis in 2008 and 9, and shortly thereafter the mining investment boom in 2011 and 12. Now remember that these series show growth in GDP rather than the level of GDP. And what this means is that so long as growth is positive, or the values are above 0 on the y-axis, then GDP will be increasing. So even if the line falls, say as it's done from one quarter to the next here, it's still above 0. So this doesn't mean that GDP is falling. Rather, it just means that GDP is increasing more slowly than it was previously. Let's look at another chart. So this bar chart is called Contributions to GDP Growth. The subtitle tells us that this growth is year-ended. If we head straight to our x-axis, we can't see time. Instead, we have the components of GDP expenditure, with GDP itself on the left there. This tells us that this chart is showing us data at a specific point in time, rather than a time series of how growth in GDP has changed over time. Now we can relate this chart to our previous one. So if we put them next to each other there, on the right hand side, the observation for GDP on our contributions chart is as at March 2020. We can tell that from the legend, which I've put a red box around. This is the same as the last data point from our time series of year-ended GDP growth on the left-hand chart. So let's look at some other information on our contributions chart. So the y-axis has the unit percentage points. Percentage points are usually used when we're showing data that involves adding or subtracting percentages. Here we're adding percentages because growth in the different components of GDP, so consumption, the different types of investment, government spending, exports and less imports, they'll all add together to give GDP growth. The numbers won't add exactly though because this chart is missing a few small components of GDP. Interpreting the data, we can see that growth in most components of GDP was negative in the March 2020 quarter, meaning that those categories of GDP became smaller. The exceptions are government spending, which grew strongly due to an increase in fiscal expenditure, and mining investment, which began growing again recently for the first time in a number of years. There's also a positive bar for imports. Now this can be a little bit confusing. The positive bar for imports indicates that imports contributed positively to GDP. But remember that imports usually subtract from GDP. So this means imports would have actually had to have fallen to contribute positively to GDP. If you recall from maths class, this is because two negatives make a positive. Let's look at a slightly more complex chart. This chart splits the economy into the mining and non-mining sectors. The subtitle tells us we're looking at year-ended growth. This chart has two panels, which are separate areas of the chart. All of the information from the main titles applies to both panels. For example, the series on both panels are showing year-ended growth. This two panel is horizontal, which means that the x-axis is common to both panels. The x-axis shows time, and so we know again we're dealing with time series data. The top panel is labelled as mining, and it has an asterisk next to it, which we'll shortly return to. This type of chart is called a stacked bar line. The bars are the different parts of the mining sector, so growth in mining investment in the orange and growth in resource exports in the blue. These bars are stacked on top of each other and should add to the line, which is total growth in the mining sector. But if you look closely, you might see that the bars almost but don't exactly add up to the line. And this is where the star comes in. It relates to the footnote, which explains why this is the case. Remember, you only need to look at footnotes if you want some extra information about the graph, so we won't go into it here. Looking at the data, we can see the key events in the mining sector. There's the big increase in growth in mining investment during the mining investment boom in 2011 and 2012, and you can then see the unwind of this mining investment boom in the years that followed, with the mining sector instead supported by growth in resource exports, as those projects that were invested in began to produce output. Now the bottom panel is labelled non-mining, and it shows growth in the non-mining sector. If you notice the range on the y-axis, the scale and increments are much larger on the mining panel compared to the non-mining panel. This is one area where you always want to exercise caution. At first glance, the series look quite similar, but once you take the different scales into account, the story changes completely. For instance, you can see that growth in the non-mining sector is much smoother than the mining sector, even with the smaller scales on the y-axis. One observation that we could make is that the mining sector is much more volatile, or in other words, growth moves around a lot more than the non-mining sector. Moving on to another chart, this chart is called employment and hours worked. We're looking at time series data again here. Now, if we look at the subtitle, it says 2008 average equals 100. Well, what does that mean? Well, if we look at the units, they're an index. The subtitle tells us what each of our series is indexed or related to. In this case, each data observation is indexed or related to its average value over 2008. Now, why would you want to index something? Well, for one, indexing allows us to compare things with vastly different levels on the same chart. If we take our chart for an example, the blue line is the total number of people employed, and the pink line is the total hours those people that were employed worked during a week. Now, the hours worked by people is of course going to be way larger than the number of people employed, since everybody tends to work more than 1 hour each week. By indexing these series, we can easily show them on the same chart and compare their trends over time. Indexing also allows us to quickly calculate cumulative changes since the index period. For instance, if the employment index was at 120 prior to its recent fall, then we immediately know that at that point, employment was 20% higher than its average level in 2008. What can we learn from this chart? Well, in the recent data, hours worked looks to have fallen by more than employment. This means that some people remained employed but worked less hours than previously. This is confirmed by the average hours series, which also declined. Now, one disadvantage of indexing is that we have no sense of the actual levels of these series. For example, we don't know whether 1,000, 1,000,000 or 10 million people are employed just from looking at this chart. Therefore, we only want to use indexing when we're trying to compare series that have different levels, or if we're interested in looking at the cumulative change in a series over time. Right, so that's all the charts that we're going to look at in this video. Here's some tips for reading charts. See if these are the same as the things that you wrote down as we went through this video. So the first thing is that you always want to keep the difference between a level and a growth rate in the back of your mind when you're interpreting charts. You should also check whether you're looking at time series or some other type of data. Use the information on the chart like the subtitle, units, scales, and labels to help you figure out what's going on in the chart before you have a go at interpreting the data. This information can help you figure out what kind of data you're looking at, how the data may have been transformed, and its frequency and the different scales on the X and Y axes. Related to that, always be careful to check the scales on the X and Y axes because they can be different between panels and also on the left-hand and right-hand side of the same panel. This can make a big difference to when you're interpreting the data. Finally, footnotes are a place where extra information is provided if you have questions about the data. Otherwise, you can sort of leave them out. So that's all I was going to cover in this video. If you want to learn more, I suggest you visit our latest statement of monetary policy, which I've left a link for in the description. Pick some charts out that look interesting and read the 1 or 2 paragraphs above them. This will contain the RBA's interpretation of those particular charts. See you next time.